In 2015, geneticists were working with indigenous tribes in the Amazon rainforest. They were trying to use genetics to understand when and how modern humans entered the Americas, when they made a really unexpected discovery.
And we found this different ancestry.
Part of the ancestry of these Native Americans was more closely related to Aboriginal Australians, Papuans, Andamanese Islanders.
Very surprised. I was very surprised. I didn't imagine something like that.
They called this ancestry Population Y, after Ipiquera, which means ancestor in the Tupi language family that these people spoke. How could it be that people in the heart of the Amazon had this ancestral relationship to people on the other side of the world? Where did that ancestry come from? I got to speak to two geneticists working on this mystery, Tábita Hünemeier and Marcos Araujo Castro e Silva. Today, we're going to discuss what we know and don't know about Population Y, why it hasn't been found in North America, where did this ancestry come from? Just don't expect any easy answers. This is not the kind of video that is going to come to a nice, neat conclusion. This is definitely still a work in progress.
I'm happy if you understand something because we are really confused as well.
It's complicated. It's complicated.
It's really complicated. Yeah.
This video is sponsored by MyHeritage. One of the reasons I love studying evolution and prehistory is I just want to figure out my place in this enormous tapestry of humanity. This is where MyHeritage comes in. You can send in a sample of your DNA so you can participate in these big population genetics studies. It's interesting that Tipperary showed up in this DNA result, because as I would learn, my great-grandfather, Patrick, he was from Tipperary, and I didn't know that before I started looking into it. This is where MyHeritage really excels. It helps you understand your past in a much more intimate and human way. Check out this church. This is the church that my great-grandfather, Frederick, got married in 1867. This is his real signature, shows his wife Catherine, who wasn't my great-grandma, and his father Joseph, my great-great-grandfather, whose occupation is listed as cork maker. If you've got a hole in a bottle, just give my great-great-granddad Joe a shout. He'll put you right. I found all of this through MyHeritage. It's home to 19 billion historical records from all over the world. I literally love searching these for clues to my family's origins. MyHeritage also searches these records too to make discoveries. All you need to know is your parents and grandparents, and it can start piecing together your family tree for you. Let me just add Big Joe to my family tree here. Look at that. Great-great-grandfather. I'm literally here just going through that match with Joseph, doing the family tree. Fire on the TV. I found 2 generations beyond my great-great-grandmother. I'm deep in the 18th century now. That's kind of crazy. It's kind of exciting. It just adds such a warm, personal depth to the study of history, studying your own family. I think you'll love it. I just think you'll absolutely love it. If all of this interests you, you can sign up for a free 14-day trial with the link below, link in the description. But if you do find it enjoyable, then you will get 50% off your subscription too. It's a win-win, win-win-win. Go check it out. Go see if you descend from a long line of cork makers. Big shout out to MyHeritage. Back to Population Y. When humans arrived in America is one of the most debated questions in archaeology. 25,000 years ago, a huge ice sheet covered basically all of Canada. This ice lowered the sea level so much that America was attached to Asia in a now sunken landmass called Beringia. It was a cold time. The height of the Ice Age, there was mammoths and stuff. Cold. Cold, cold, cold. Even though America was connected to Asia, this ice certainly blocked the way inland. It didn't melt enough for a gap in the ice to emerge until around 13,800 years ago. For a long time, archaeologists hypothesized that humans didn't enter America until this gap in the ice formed. However, now we know humans were in the Americas before this point. So, the current thinking is that humans entered the Americas from Beringia and hugged the coastline. Problem is, when all that ice melted, it raised sea levels. So if we're right, the earliest archaeological sites are almost certainly underwater, deep under the North Pacific, as much as 50 kilometers, 35 miles out to sea. That's how much the sea has risen in that time. Most archaeologists would be happy with saying humans arrived in the Americas around 16,000 years ago. This year I went to a really cool archaeological site in Idaho that dates to around then. Check it out for sure. However, there are some sites which could be much, much older. There are footprints in White Sands, New Mexico, which seemingly date to around 21,000 years ago. Some archaeologists argue that the site of Chiquahite Cave in Mexico dates to around 30,000 years ago. Other archaeologists in Brazil argue some sites date back as much as 50,000 years ago. And don't even get me started on the Ceruti Mastodon. The further you go back in time, the more archaeologists disagree. But what we can say is that the simple model of humans waiting until the gap in the ice melted, it doesn't fit with what we now know. We now know it's much more complicated. From a genetics standpoint, up until recently, there was also a relatively simple picture. Groups of North and East Asians entered Beringia. They were kind of isolated here from between 4 to 10,000 years and left it as Native Americans. The genetic dating of this journey into America also lines up well with the more recent, more widely accepted archaeological sites.
What we usually agree is between 15 and 18.
Between 15 and 18. Okay. But just like our archaeological understanding has gotten more complex, it's fair to say that the discovery of population Y complicates this simple genetic model too.
We have to start to think about the peopling of America and the people of Asia and the Beringia stencil as a dynamic process that took thousands of years and is much more complex than we thought in the past.
All right, what can we say with some confidence about population Y? I don't want to say for sure, because this is an area of growing research, but what can we say with some confidence, a little bit of confidence? First thing we have to mention is that we have no skeletons. That's a really important detail. We have no remains from this population Y. None at all. This is what geneticists call an unsampled population. We see this contribution of ancestry, but we have no remains from population Y. That's a big limiting factor in how much information we have. Until we find those remains, think of population Y as kind of a hypothetical population. It's a model that geneticists can use to explain how two groups of people are related. If we find more ancient remains closely related to population Y, then our understanding might change dramatically. Second thing we can say for sure is that the signal is real. It really was detected. Since 2015, geneticists have done more studies into this population Y, confirmed those earlier results, confirmed that ancestral connection. You can see it here in this map from Tábita and Marcos's last study on population Y. They also found coastal groups with this signal, like the Chotuna, the Quichua, groups like that live on the Pacific coast. They found it in more Amazonian groups. This ancestral connection is real, and there are many Native Americans across South America who have this Y ancestry.
And we found some population that show the signal, showing that the signal is much more widespread than we thought before, since it was only found in Amazonia, and now we had detected in the coastal Pacific and in other populations from Brazil, from southern Brazil and the central Brazilian plateau.
Third thing super important to say is that these people are Native Americans. They are most closely related to other Native Americans. This population Y ancestry forms about 1 to 3% of their genome. Don't think of these people as Australasians in the middle of the Amazon. They're Native Americans, and they are most closely related to other Native Americans. Fourth thing we can say is that Pop Y ancestry is old. It's very old. This wasn't a recent thing that just happened. And we know that for sure because of this archaeological site here. This is Lapo do Santo, in the, what's the name of it? Lagoa Santa region of Brazil. Between sort of 12,000 and 9,000 years ago, I believe, this region was home to a group of people who were living classic hunter-gatherer lives. They ate deer and fish and armadillo. They carved images into the wall of their cave. Very dramatic looking cave there. Look at that. Incredible stuff. Here's kind of a little carving on the cave wall that these people made. Some sort of human figure, maybe human animal-like figure. Interesting stuff, interesting stuff. And they engaged in really ornate, elaborate burial rituals. Here you can see a burial. The skull's decapitated, the hands are over their face. Pretty grisly stuff, not going to lie. It seems like they were practicing cannibalism. Here you can see another skull used as a receptacle for other bones. Sometimes it went down like that in prehistory. What can you do? There had long been a debate about this community because some anthropologists believe that their skulls resemble the skulls of Aboriginal Australians, groups like that, more than modern Native Americans. So obviously when geneticists learned about population Y, these burials were a prime target to study.
When we were able to sequence these Lagoa Santa specimens, they were not related to the Australasian. They are 100% Native Americans, most of them, and one of them was about 2% of Australasian ancestry. So 2% 10,000 years ago and 2% nowadays. It's odd, the distribution of the genome.
This almost reminds me about the debate about Kennewick. The initial look at the skeleton, people thought, oh, it's not Native American. Genetics confirmed, definitely Native American. Same with the people at Lagoa Santa. Initial impression, these people don't look very Native American or not like modern Native Americans, but tests confirmed they're definitely Native American. It just goes to show you can't rely 100% on just the appearance of bones, right? People's appearances can change over the course of thousands and thousands of years. But they did also find that Y ancestry in these 10,000-year-old specimens. 10KYA. This Y ancestry was introduced a long time ago. The final thing we can say for sure about population Y at this moment in time is that it hasn't been found in the north. Hasn't been found in northern Native American groups. And that's really interesting. I really wanted to ask Marcus and Tábita why they think that is the case. One possibility is that Native Americans further north did have this ancestry, but it has been obscured by European contact.
The lack of evidence in the North Hemisphere could be due to the population collapse and the contact era. Because as 90% of the population was decimated, maybe was there and we just lost because of the genocide.
Yeah, if only some of the groups had this ancestry and you exterminate most of them, you could have basically erased the presence of this ancestry because you don't have the population that had it before. They don't exist anymore.
Another explanation could be that we simply don't have many samples, genetic samples from Native Americans in the north of America. We just don't have many samples. Now, this is a topic full of nuance, definitely not one that I'm an expert in. There are 574 recognized tribes in the USA, 634 First Nations in Canada. So there definitely isn't one explanation behind this lack of samples. But my understanding is, for many tribes, for many people, it's not that they are anti-science, but there is not a lot of trust in the government and in academic institutions. They don't feel respected by these organizations. There are still well over 100,000 human remains held by American institutions alone that were collected, taken, stolen from descendant communities without their input or consent. These museums and universities have a legal obligation to return them, and yet progress is still so slow. Hundreds of thousands of remains still sitting in boxes, in universities, in museums. So considering that, why participate in more studies? Why help these places with their research, basically? if they do participate in a study, many are concerned that they want to maintain ownership and control over these genetic samples. There's a case where a Native American tribe agreed to participate in a diabetes study to help the health of their population. Diabetes study never took place, and the information was sold to participate in population genetics. So, not a lot of trust. Not a lot of trust. Hopefully, as I said, these concerns can be addressed. Many Native Americans and tribes do participate in genetic studies. There are organizations like the Native Biodata Consortium who are working hard to address these concerns. So in the future, who knows? Hopefully that will change, but as it stands right now, there's just not loads of samples. Finally, people with Y ancestry could have just left little impact in North America in the twists and turns of history. As I said at the start, the current hypothesis for the peopling of America is that these ancestral Native Americans traveled down the coast pretty quickly too, it seems. Maybe it's possible that the people with more Y ancestry just continued on the coast, continued down into South America, and left a small impact in North America, or maybe no impact in North America, no contribution, or that contribution has been obscured by later population movements, in the following 16, 17, 18, 20,000 years. There is some evidence to support this idea. In South America, people on the Pacific coast seemingly do have a higher percentage of this population Y ancestry.
What we see is that the Pacific coast have a slightly higher percentage of this Australasian-like ancestry, and this indicates that the Australasian component was introduced in these Native Americans before the Pacific coast populations and the Amazonian were diverged from one another.
So yeah, maybe this population just carried on the coast, skipped North America. It's possible. It's a possible explanation. Who knows what the future will hold if there are more samples available to study, now that we have things like sedimentary ancient DNA, getting DNA from the plaque of teeth that doesn't destroy ancient remains, less invasive ways of getting human DNA. Maybe we will find this population Y ancestry further north. But what can we say about where this signal came from, where this contribution came from? What was going on in Asia? The Asian population alive today that is the closest relative of this small percentage of population Y ancestry are the Onge. They live on Little Andaman Island, a very isolated region of the Indian Ocean. Contact with the British and then later Indian settlers has really threatened their society. They once occupied the entire island, but it's now believed that there's just about 100 of them left, and they live on a reservation, on a small percentage of the land that they once roamed. It's a sad state of affairs. There's no two ways around it. It is sad. It's important to say that this population Y ancestry doesn't descend directly from the Onge. No one from Andaman Island set sail and went all the way to Beringia.
Because probably it's not this population, the Onge population, but some ancestor of the population that shares some ancestry with also North Asian population, then enter in Beringia, and there is some kind of structure or something like that some individuals, when migrate southwards, spread this ancestry in South America.
Homo sapiens left Africa sometime between 50 and 100,000 years ago. This was probably a process that took thousands and thousands of years, so it's difficult to come up with a precise date, but that's the range that we're working with here, roughly. Imagine just the vastness of Asia and these small groups of hunter-gatherers just slowly living their lives, making their way across the land. Some headed south, and their descendants today live in India and Andaman Islands and Papua New Guinea and Australia. Some headed north into Siberia and China and Japan, and eventually, of course, America. When we draw maps like this, it all looks so neat and tidy, doesn't it? One line goes this way, one line goes another way. They separate and never see each other again. But that, of course, is not the reality. Groups continue to mix, continue to stay in contact with each other, sleep with their neighbors. Who doesn't do that? Me, I don't do that. It's not these neat lines left and right. Groups continue to have contact with each other, sometimes for thousands upon thousands of years. One of these groups of these small bands of hunter-gatherers was probably population Y. They contributed ancestry to the ancestors of the Onge. They contributed ancestry to other groups in Asia who would eventually get to Beringia and become Native Americans. Absolutely everyone alive today is a mix of different people. Whether that migration or contact happened thousands of years ago or more recently in history, everyone is a mix of different relationships. Let me show you a great example of what I'm talking about here. This is Hoa Binh, a mountainous province of northern Vietnam, home to the most incredible landscape, 40 different ethnic groups, and the occasional water buffalo, of course. It also lends its name to an archaeological culture called the Hoa Binian. I think the exact timing of when this culture was active is still up for debate, but between 17 and 4,000 years ago seems reasonable. Some put this culture way deeper into prehistory, 40,000 years ago. Geneticists were able to get samples from 2 burials associated with this Hoa Binian culture.
These Hoa Binian individuals, they are most closely related to present-day Onge. Among all present-day Southeast Asians, they're mostly closely related to Onge.
Despite the fact that they lived in what's now Vietnam and China in that region, again, their closest relatives today are the Onge. Further north, the Jomon culture of Japan, creators of some of the most beautiful pottery you ever did see. Shout out to the Dogu, look at these chaps or chapettes. Brilliant. Genetic studies of the Jomon show that they're also related to Hoa Binian culture. They're also this mix of Southern Asian and East Asian ancestry.
And they also find in this paper that individuals from the Jomon culture in Japan might also be explained as an admixture between East Asian ancestries and this Hoa Binian ancestry or hunter-gatherer from Southeast Asia ancestry.
So, in modern times, the Onge are on their small island and other Australasian and Melanesian peoples are very far south, Australia, Papua New Guinea. But deep in prehistory, in ancient times, from China to Vietnam to Japan, different people had ancestry related to these groups. They were much more widespread than they are in our modern time. Any one of these hunter-gatherer groups could have contributed ancestry to North Asian people who would eventually get to Beringia, who would eventually get to America. Any one of them could have done it. By the time you're in Japan, you're getting pretty close to Beringia. And if you saw my video about the archaeological site in Idaho, there's interesting similarities between the material culture of Japan and the material culture of America in this sort of 16,000-year-old time period. There's probably a lot of connections between all these different regions. You don't need an Onge person to travel all the way to Beringia to explain this population Y ancestry. According to Tábita and Marcos, this is the simplest explanation for population Y ancestry in Native Americans.
No, it's the main idea of at least our hypothesis that they arrived in America admixed.
It's just another piece of Australasian ancestry, another relationship to these groups of people that was much more common in prehistory, much more widespread, even though we might think of these groups of people as very distant now. However, as I said at the start, population Y is still unsampled. We don't have a genetic signal from this group, just from its 2 descendants. And because of that, we have to keep our minds open to a couple more interesting possibilities. As I mentioned at the start, many archaeologists and many geneticists are mostly in agreement that modern humans reached the Americas between 15 and 18,000 years ago. A lot of people will agree with that statement, except for the fact that we have these few outlying sites that are older. Looking at you, White Sands, what are you going on about? Is it possible that population Y were the people behind these early archaeological sites, that they were already in America when these other groups from Beringia arrived? Is that possible?
What I would say again is that as a possibility, but the evidence doesn't go in that direction.
Yes, It is possible. With the limited evidence that we have about population Y, it's possible. As Marcos said, though, is the evidence going in that direction? Nicht. It is not. The 10,000-year-old remains from Lagoa Santa in Brazil already had such a small percentage of population Y ancestry. It just doesn't seem like this population Y was the founding population of the Americas. It's hard to imagine a scenario where this group was widespread across 2 continents, from the Andes to the Amazon to Patagonia, huge varied landscape, and yet every single trace of them has been lost. No bones, nothing, not any sizable contribution of ancestry to groups that came later. It's just so hard to believe. In all the different population movements in Asia throughout history, we still have the Onge and Australians and Papua New Guineans, evidence of Albinians and Jomon and all of these groups. So why would every trace of these people be lost in the Americas? Not even in the deepest valley of the Andes or the remotest corner of Patagonia did any of these people survive. It just seems unlikely, especially as we learn more about how widespread this ancestry was in Asia in prehistory. It's much more likely that the ancestors of Native Americans arrived in America with this population Y ancestry already, that it was just one of the groups, one of these small hunter-gatherer groups in Asia, just creating this tapestry of humanity. But our evidence can change. Our evidence can change. Now, there is one more hypothesis that I know you archaeology nerds are going to love. I can see into your soul, because I am you. You're going to love this. You're going to love this last hypothesis. So we know that this unsampled population, population Y, contributed ancestry to the Onge. It contributed ancestry to groups across South America. That's what we know. But it is unsampled. We don't have any remains from population Y. The distribution of this genome between like 1 and 3%, it sort of reminds you of somebody. It sort of reminds you of these people, Neanderthals, Denisovans. It sort of resembles that distribution in our genome.
One thing that we didn't touch, and I think it's important, but it's more complicated than all things that we discuss here, is that this Y ancestry could be an ancient Homo or Denisova or something like that.
It sounds crazy to think that population Y might be a currently unknown group of archaic humans, of ancient humans. But you have to remember, before modern genetics, we had no idea that Neanderthals bred with modern humans as they left Africa. But they did. And even going back further and further in time, we know that they were interbreeding with each other. We had no idea that Denisovans existed until we tested their genetic remains. And once we had done that, we could see, oh yes, look, they also contributed ancestry to modern humans, particularly Asia, Papua New Guinea, Australia, the Americas. Population Y could be a similar situation. We have this clue that these two groups share this ancestral relationship, but who contributed that DNA is not known. And when and if we find a sample from this group, it could be that they were a Neanderthal-like group living in Asia, something like that. I mean, the more we learn about prehistory in Asia, the more complex it gets. They are always finding new craniums, new bones, interesting things. Human evolution in Asia is such a fascinating topic. Humans of one form or another were living there for 2 million years. It's such a big continent, such a varied landscape, that evolution just got really funky down there. And it's totally possible that population Y was an archaic human. And our first clue to their existence is this excess of affinity between the Onge and groups in South America. Could be. Could very well be. It's just so hard to say. We just have to find a sample from this population. Until then, we won't know. That's the piece of the puzzle that we're missing.
It's difficult to discuss because makes sense, yes, makes sense. But we don't have enough evidence. even to test it.
I've come for a walk in the woods to process all that information. It's chilly. It's chilly today. I suppose the big takeaway is that just as the archaeological record has gotten more complicated, the genetic story of the peopling of the Americas has gotten so much more complicated too. Modern Native Americans are not one homogenous group, and their ancestors, your ancestors, if you're Native American watching this, I hope you find it interesting, were not one homogenous group either. Their ancestry reflects complicated patterns of human dispersal, not just across the Americas, but across Asia too, connecting far-flung regions like the Andaman Islands to Vietnam, to Japan, to the Brazilian rainforest, and potentially even to long-lost branches of humanity, archaic humans. It's crazy, man. Humanity is a rich tapestry. I love learning about ancient genetics. God, it's just the best. It's the absolute best. Thanks for watching. Thanks to Marcos, Tábita, and everyone who participated in this research. Shout out to all of you. Whoop.
Thank you so much for watching to the end. It was a major goal of mine this year to make a video about population Y, and I couldn't have done it without Tábita and Marcos. Shout out to them. I couldn't have done it without you guys watching and supporting the videos, and of course none of it could be done without the participation of native groups across South America. So in honor of that, I've donated $1,000 of the MyHeritage sponsorship to Amazon Watch, just to try and share the wealth to these communities in the best way I can. Thank you so much for watching. It's so interesting. Lots more great stuff to come.